Okay, seems like recording has started. Right. I am going to share my screen. I think you're out there, Brad. Maybe you could admit folks while I'm sharing my screen. Just in case I can't see it. A thumbs up from everyone that looks all right. Good view. Okay, thank you. So, yeah, I'm Deb Hahn. I help coordinate Southern Wings for the U.S. State Fish and Wildlife Agencies, along with Brad Wilkinson, who is on the call on the webinar here, and you'll hear from him in a bit. And I'm just really excited to be able to share this pretty amazing work with you. Southern Wings, in case you're not familiar, was really created to work on full annual cycle conservation for shared priority birds, where it takes resources from U.S. state fish and wildlife agencies and brings those to bear on projects for shared species. When the states created this program, they really wanted to complement their in-state investment that they're making on the breeding and stopover grounds, and also help support successful implementation of the state wildlife action plans. So Southern Wings celebrated 15 years last year, and we were really excited that 42 U.S. state fish and wildlife agencies were able to help partners put conservation on the ground across the hemisphere, leverage dollars, conserve and restore over 1.5 million acres, and strategically plant a lot of trees to begin reforestation and provide socioeconomic opportunities in areas that are important for all of our shared species. There are a variety of projects that Southern Wings helps support, whether that's grassland work in northern Mexico or looking at research on key stopover and wintering sites with Selva through the Neotropical Flyways Project, or conservation of shorebirds along the Pacific Flyway. We try to offer states an easy, flexible, and transparent process. There are lots of different funding sources that state agencies use. We have lots of mechanisms to move that funding, whether that's regional associations, flyway councils, or through US-based NGOs. As you noticed from the last slide, we leverage state funds, and we also can provide non-federal match for state wildlife grants and Pittman-Robertson funds, which is incredibly important at times. And I think one of the biggest things is that the partners on the ground that implement these projects are just incredible. Like we are just so lucky with the individuals and organizations that we work with. So one of the key things for Southern Wings has been to show the linkages between state agencies and these key sites. Nick Bailey provided this slide. He's from Selva. It shows tracking for 23 golden wing warblers, and they're linked to locations in Costa Rica. So as we all know, we're getting more and more great data. And so the question is, how do we use this data to make conservation investment decisions? And this is what we were hoping to provide for with the online guide. It was in particular created for state fish and wildlife agencies. You will see that when you get to see some of these next presenters. But I really think lots of organizations could use it. It was funded by a multi-state conservation grant, and it was our partners, who you'll see here, National Audubon Society, American Bird Conservancy, Georgetown University, and Cornell Lab of Ornithology, really brought their expertise and data to bear to support Southern Wings, to support the conservation of migratory birds, and to support state agency implementation of their state wildlife action plans. So coming up here today, you'll first hear from Brad Wilkinson from AFWA to do a little intro to the guide from a state perspective. You'll next hear from Erica Knight and Jill Deppy from National Audubon Society, and then Andrew Stillman and Viviana Ruiz from Cornell Lab of Ornithology. So please feel free to share any questions or comments in the chat while they're presenting, but we will have time for Q&A at the end. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brad, and he'll kick things off.
Great, thanks, Deb. Just going to share my screen. Great, so hopefully that should be showing for y'all. As Deb mentioned, the purpose of the online guide is to be a resource to help specifically state agencies, but really any group who's interested in full annual cycle conservation and understanding where the birds within their jurisdiction might go. We want state agencies specifically to really maximize the finite resources that they have and make a tool that that shows state agency personnel where exactly they can put those resources to be most impactful. The link at the bottom there is the website for the online guide, and I would encourage you to go and click around it when you have some time. What I'm going to spend my time focusing on today is just a quick vignette about how a state wildlife agency biologist or resource planner might use the guide to identify a project for which they can contribute their resources that would have a meaningful impact to the birds of their state. So for this example, I'm going to be using Ohio. It's the state that I'm from. I think it has great birds. And it also has some really good information that we put together as a kind of an example for how this can be used. So for the next couple of minutes, I'd like you to imagine yourself as a Ohio DNR biologist who knows that you want to contribute to full annual cycle conservation, but is unsure where exactly to put those dollars. So when you go to the online guide, one of the first things you'll see is a list of states for which we have information, and that's 49 states right now, excluding Hawaii, excuse me. But for all those other states, you have your own separate page that has state-specific information. So I would click on Ohio, and this is kind of the first thing I would be confronted with on the website is a link, or an overview of what's provided for each state. So we have a section of a state overview, we have a section on focal species, on project partners, and then additional resources. And I'll walk through all 4 of these sections, but just to get you oriented to what each page would look like, this is kind of the first step in that. So if we would scroll down to the state overview section, one of the first things you'll see are maps. And these maps specifically were generated by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology using their eBird Status and Trends tool. I will let the folks from Cornell kind of really get into the details behind these maps, how they were created, those sort of things. But I want to provide an overview for how they might be used. So the first map that you might see is the shared stewardship map. And for Ohio, this includes 41 migratory species. And what this map is showing is where those 41 species are concentrated during the non-breeding season. So you'll see in this map the outline of Ohio in black there. And then you have these colors ranging from yellow to purple. The more purple the color is, the more of a shared connection is between those breeding birds of Ohio and those non-breeding areas. So for this map, you might take a look at it and see that there's a lot of purple around the Yucatan Peninsula and Belize and in Nicaragua. And then you also see a lot of purple in the Colombian mountains of Ecuador, the Andes Mountains of Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. So if I'm just looking at this map very quickly, I might pinpoint those 2 areas as areas that have a really strong connection between the breeding birds of Ohio and those non-wintering grounds. Next to it, you'll see a map that looks a little bit similar, but also a little bit different. And this is the shared stewardship uniqueness map using those same data sources from Cornell. And this map is really showing the unique contributions that Ohio can make towards its non-breeding birds, or the non-breeding habitats that affect Ohio birds relative to other states. And that's kind of the important piece here. So the shared stewardship map shows all the connections. This is really showing those unique Ohio connections as opposed to other states. And so you can see when you compare those two maps side by side, what was really that high connected area in the Yucatan and Central America kind of falls out in the shared stewardship uniqueness map. And the shared stewardship uniqueness side, it's a little bit more yellow. It's not as much of a unique connection. So what we can say is that the birds from Ohio are using those areas, but so are a lot of birds from other states. Missouri birds are using that area. New York birds might be using that area. It's a very important area, but it's an area used by a large number of states versus those kind of Andes Mountains areas in Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. Those retain that purple color in the shared stewardship uniqueness map. And so what that's telling me is that relative to other states, Ohio's birds are using that area and they're using it in a very unique way. That those sites specifically are not only important to North American birds, they're really important to Ohio's birds, like I said, in this very unique way. And so that's kind of the first step of some of the information that you'd be confronted with on the website. Scrolling down a little bit further, you'll find a table listing some of the focal species that we think would be really important for Ohio DNR to take attention of or to put conservation money towards. This table shows a lot of different information for these species, and I'll walk you through those. So you see on the left-hand side the common name of the bird, the scientific name of the bird. Next to it is a column, SGCN, that stands for Species of Greatest Conservation Need. And so this column lets you know for Ohio, is that species listed as a SCGN? Is it a state important bird? So wood thrush is an SCGN, chimney swift is an SCGN, anything that has a yes, that's been highlighted by your state agency as something that is of high conservation concern. Next to it is a BCC listing, that's the birds of continental concern. This is put out by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So this is similar to SCGN, but it's at a federal level. Is this species identified federally as one of unique conservation importance? So for example, wood thrush and cerulean warbler are both species of continental concern. Blue-winged warbler is a regional species of concern. And so it helps you kind of look at this table and understand, is this important to the state and is it important federally? The next column over is R2R. This is a listing that's put together by the Road to Recovery Initiative. And the Road to Recovery has identified what they're calling tipping point species. And these tipping point species are species that have lost 50% or more of their population in the last 50 years and are on track to lose another 50% in the next 50 years. And there's different levels of urgency, ranging from yellow to orange to red. And so this column is letting you know, has this been identified by R2R as one of those tipping point species? So again, for example, wood thrush, cerulean warbler, those are yellow alert tipping point species, whereas blue-winged warbler is not a tipping point species at all. So these different labels might help you understand, how urgent are the conservation issues surrounding them, and how many different groups have identified them to be a conservation priority. Next to it, you'll see a column labeled percent breeding population. I think this is one of the most valuable tools in the table. This was put together to let each state know how much of the breeding population they're responsible for in their state. So for example, cerulean warbler is 11.37%. This means that roughly Ohio hosts 11% of the breeding population, the global breeding population of cerulean warblers. Wood thrush is 8.19%. Like I said, this would mean that Ohio is responsible for roughly 8% of the global wood thrush breeding population. So if you sort this column, it gives you an idea about which species Ohio, for example, has a really unique stewardship potential for. So if I was looking at this map, I might say cerulean warbler, wood thrush, blue-winged warbler, Henslow sparrows, that are all species that really depend on Ohio habitats and for which full annual cycle conservation outside of Ohio would have a really unique and meaningful connection to that state. And then lastly, you'll see a column labeled focal. This is indicating whether or not further down this page, there's focal information for that species that we've put together. And I'll get I will show you some examples of what that focal, unique species-specific information looks like. So scrolling down a little bit further, you'll see a map generated by the National Audubon Society in partnership with the Bird Migration Explorer that is showing unique connections from Ohio to other geographies based on specific telemetry data. So each hexagon, and I guess this will be explained a little bit in further detail, but each hexagon is colored in a way to let you know, has there been a bird that's been tracked with GPS, with MODIS, with geolocations that have connected a cell in Ohio to a different cell outside of that range. So overall, this map is telling me that once again, I'm seeing a lot of really strong connections between Ohio and some of those Central American geographies that we looked at. I'm also seeing some strong connections in Northern South America in the Andes of Colombia and Venezuela. So this map complements very well the maps I was looking at earlier, and it tells me, not only are the model distributions similar, but the actual tracking data that's been collected from individual birds supports that information that those areas are highly connected. So I mentioned that there was some information that was specific for focal species. If I recall, looking at that table, one of the species that really stood out was the cerulean warbler. It was listed on a number of different federal and state conservation priority databases. Ohio was responsible for over 11% of its breeding population. So I might choose cerulean warbler as a species for which I'm really interested in contributing to in a full annual cycle conservation way. And if I click on cerulean warbler from the focal species table, one of the things that I'm presented with is another connections map. This is similar to the one that I just showed. However, it's showing unique information for individually tracked cerulean warblers that were contributed to that Bird Migration Explorer. So looking at this map, things in dark purple, there's data from a cerulean warbler which passed through Ohio to that specific geography. Locations that are that lighter shaded purple are also tracks from cerulean warblers, but cerulean warblers that may not have used Ohio. So as I'm looking at this map, I can see
Oh boy, we may have lost Brad. Well, I will say that Brad was just getting to the point where he was going to connect this information to a Southern Wings project and to partners on the ground. So we will circle back with him if he manages to get back with us. I know he was having some computer issues earlier, so yes, it seems like trouble with a laptop. So I think Jill and Erica will move to you guys and circle back with Brad's presentation at the end if we can.
Great. And Brad was just going to set us up nicely for what we'll introduce. We got to maybe the right part. So thanks, Deb. Thanks to everyone who is joining us today to learn about the Southern Wings online guide. I think most of us who are on the call recognize that, we have over 90% of our migratory species that regularly breed in the U.S. spend time outside of the U.S., especially in Latin America and the Caribbean, where they depend on safe habitat during migration, and also our winter, the northern winter. And halting and reversing the population declines of migratory species, as Deb said, really requires a hemispheric full annual cycle approach. And at Audubon, hemispheric conservation is one of the drivers of our new recently completed flight plan, our strategic plan. In fall 2022, Audubon and 9 partners created the Bird Migration Explorer, which you see here. Erica is showing it on the screen. I hope you can see these slides properly. They look great from my end. And the Explorer is an online guide that combines different types of data, migration science, to reveal the most important places where we need to protect migratory birds and their habitat across the full annual cycle. And the Explorer, which you see here, is powered literally by millions and millions of tracking and connectivity data that were generously shared with Audubon by individual research scientists and organizations. And I'm happy to say that 2 of our partners on the Explorer, Georgetown University and Cornell Lab of Ornithology, who were partners on the Explorer are also partners on the online guide. The Explorer, we're showing it here because the Explorer is the foundation for the connection maps and information on conservation challenges that Erica is going to show to you in a moment. So with that, I'd like to introduce Erica Knight. She is a GIS and data scientist specialist on Audubon's Migratory Bird Initiative team. And I'll pass it to you, Erica.
Great, thanks, Jill. So I'm going to jump right in, and let's see if I can advance my slides. There we go. So today I'm going to provide background for many of the maps and the data that are included in the guide. And as Brad mentioned, the guide is organized by state. Each page of the guide includes an overview section on the select focal species, the information about key partners, and additional resources. And so for demo purposes today, I'm selecting State of Washington. At the top of the page, as you saw with Brad, you'll find the 4 key links that let you jump to specific content. And I'm going to jump right in by starting on the focal species section. So clicking that link takes you to the focal migratory species section of the guide, where each state has this compiled list that you just saw of neotropical migratory species identified across the multiple initiatives. Before I jump into more details, I also want to point out that each section of the website includes an expandable link that explains the methodology behind the compiled information. And so just keep that in mind as a resource for the future. Focusing on that table, we see that the table includes 13 species for Washington State, and the data for all 13 species were compiled to create Washington's multi-species connections maps. As Brad showed, the highlighted field on the right indicates that there's a focal species account, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But for now, we're going to focus on the full table, which is all 13 species, in this case for Washington. So multi-species connections maps show the direct connections between each state and other locations across the Western Hemisphere, with shades of purple indicating how many species travel between that location and Washington State. The connections data are based on tracking, banding, and genetic data, as Jill mentioned, that were generously shared by hundreds of scientists, institutions, and organizations for the Bird Migration Explorer. And these maps are based on known or observed connections only. So for some states, there are tagging data that were not available for all desired species. These maps are also complementary to the shared stewardship maps that, that Brad showed and that Andrew will talk more about in a bit. And they provide unique information to guide investments outside the US. They show the places in Latin America that Washington State, in this case, is most connected to through migratory birds, highlighting the places in Latin America where it may be most beneficial to focus conservation efforts, partnerships, and investments. For more localized sub-state level information and to explore the available species tagging data in more detail, the Bird Migration Explorer is a great resource. So clicking that link, arriving on the home page of the Explorer, you can select locations from either the top navigation bar or from the list of map types on the left in the red buttons. And once on the locations page, you can search for or choose a specific location, such as Olympia, Washington, as shown here, to access an interactive multi-species connections map. It's important to note a couple differences between the maps in the Southern Wings online guide and those in the Explorer. The maps in Southern Wings, while derived from the Bird Migration Explorer, are distinct because they're based on a curated species list, whereas the Explorer contains all available data for migratory species that breed in North America. And the Southern Wings maps are a subset of those species. In addition, the multi-species connections maps shown in Southern Wings are summarized for the entire state. You can see that on the left here. And in the Explorer, they're summarized into 150 kilometer hexagons. which is highlighted here for Olympia, Washington. So let's jump back to the Southern Wings Guide. Each state has a dedicated focal migratory species account section, which is accessed by scrolling down from the multi-species connections map. This section includes detailed maps and conservation challenges specific to the individual focal migratory species. And again, as mentioned earlier, those species are the ones marked yes in that right-hand column of the table. The detailed species accounts outline each species conservation status, the key challenges they face throughout the year due to human activities and environmental changes, and links to relevant Southern Wings projects and additional resources. In addition, the species-specific connections maps visualize each species' hemispheric migrations, highlighting important locations throughout their annual cycle, as shown here for long-billed curlew. In some states, tagging data were not available for a focal species, and in these instances, the single species connections map is not available, as shown here for black swift in Washington. Looking briefly at an example connection map for Washington and long-billed curlew, this map illustrates the direct connections between Washington and other locations across the hemisphere based on that available tagging data shared by researchers, where the dark purple hexagons representing locations directly connected to Washington and the light purple indicate areas with tagging data, but the species has no direct connections to Washington state. Users can also explore species-specific connections by, again, clicking the link to the Bird Migration Explorer. And here you can navigate to the bird species area of the platform using the button in the top. From there, you can filter or type in the name of the species of choice. So in this case, we'll look for long-billed curlew. And there are 3 available maps on the species page. There's a species migration map, species connections, which we'll select, and conservation challenges, which we'll talk about in a minute. While the connections maps on Southern Wings is derived from the Bird Migration Explorer, again, like the multi-species connections maps, there's an important distinction between the two. The single species map on Southern Wings highlights the direct connections between Washington state and additional locations across the hemisphere. And in contrast, the map on the right from the Bird Migration Explorer is based on an individual hexagon, providing a more detailed fine scale view of the species connections. The next major area to highlight is the conservation challenges section. We're using the term conservation challenges to indicate human activities and environmental changes that a species is sensitive to during its annual cycle. In contrast, threats are human activities and environmental changes that negatively impact a bird species. However, many human activities present threats to birds and can also present a component of solutions. So the term conservation challenge is intended to convey both the risk and opportunity associated with these activities. So this list of conservation challenges is derived from the conservation challenges included in the Bird Migration Explorer again. And those are the challenges that we were able to map across the Western Hemisphere. Again, there's much more information on the Explorer, so I'm going to jump there just briefly to show a couple highlights. There are 19 different conservation challenges included. And when viewing these maps, it's important to recognize that they show the footprint of select human activities and environmental change across the hemisphere, but they don't estimate impacts to bird populations, and they're not meant to represent a complete list of major issues facing migratory species. So you can select a conservation challenge from the list to explore the footprint of that challenge across the hemisphere. Here we're seeing a map of livestock management. And the list of species on the left shows the species that are exposed to livestock management. So you can select a species from the list to see a map of where and when that species is exposed. You can also navigate to all the available maps for each species using that bird species button at the top, like I showed earlier. So here we're viewing when and where long-billed curlew is exposed to livestock management, which is one of the conservation challenges listed for this species on the Southern Wings online guide. Again, returning to the online guide, the final thing I want to highlight is the project partners. The project partners table is embedded on each state page, and this table shows Southern Wings partner organizations working in countries that are connected to each state through migratory species, as demonstrated by the tracking, banding, and genetic data in the Explorer. The partner data were gathered through a survey distributed to collaborators of American Bird Conservancy, Audubon, Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Georgetown University, Southern Wings, and BirdLife International, America's partners. The project partners table is interactive, so you can use the fields to hide. You can hide the fields, filter, group, and sort data. You can scroll down, you can scroll across to view like the fields, including organizational details, countries, species groups, habitats, threats, conservation actions, of course, Southern Wings projects, links, partners, and notes. And for added flexibility, you can download the table as a CSV file or click to expand it for a larger view. This table becomes especially powerful when used in conjunction with the available maps. The maps can help identify the countries that migratory birds travel to from each state. And from there, you can filter the project partners table by country and species or whatever other categories of interest to narrow in on potential conservation partners across the hemisphere that have similar conservation interests. So I'm going to stop sharing there and I will pass it over to Andrew, I believe.
Thank you so much. Deb, anything from Brad or should I launch in?
I think we'll have you go in, and if Brad feels like he wants to circle back right at the end, he can. I know he was close to finishing up. Brad, does that work for you? I see that your computer
that sounds great.
allowed you to
Go
get
ahead,
back
Andrew.
on.
Sounds good. Thank you. Well, my name is Andrew Stillman, and I'm a quantitative postdoctoral fellow in the Center for Avian Population Studies at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And my goal for today was to lead you through some of the resources that are available on the online guide that come from eBird Status and Trends data products. And specifically, I wanted to focus in on that focal species table and talk about breeding percent of population. And then also those maps that Brad shared at the beginning called Shared Stewardship Connections maps. So the eBird Status and Trends project leverages volunteer checklist data collected by birders worldwide to produce information on the relative abundance and population trends of birds. I'm going to start this animation here so you can kind of see what this information looks like. So the map that I'm showing you right here, which shows kind of the relative abundance with darker colors or higher relative abundance in purple, lower values in yellow. This is for Acadian flycatcher. This map is not showing just the raw distribution of eBird checklists. It's showing modeled information that's modeled through spatiotemporal machine learning. And importantly, the models also incorporate information on the habitats of the birds and their relationships with the environment, such as land cover or nighttime lights. And I think that maps like this give us a window into where birds are at different times of the year. But we also place a lot of focus on making the actual data products and the model predictions accessible, of course. So for example, if you wanted to work with this map or actually download and use the data behind it, you can access that with the click of a button on the eBird Status and Trends website. So all the data products that are there are available for free online for you to explore and download as either images or spatial raster files that you can then load into GIS to work with on your own. And one of the ways that we're making this sort of information more accessible to US states in particular is with this website that focuses on state level data products. So this website has tables that show summaries of eBird status and trends data products for every species in every state. There's state level maps and GIS files that kind of assist with the state level access to these sorts of information products. And then with the Southern Wings Guide, we're particularly highlighting some of the state level information from this website that's useful for full annual cycle conservation. So I mentioned up front that one of the things that I wanted to talk through is this focal species table. And you've already heard about this with some amazing presentations that went through each of the columns and everything. And the thing that I wanted to highlight was this column right here on the percent breeding population. Now, modeling bird populations across their entire ranges using eBird data means that we can calculate the percent of a bird's population within geographic areas like US states. And we can do this for different seasons. So all 4 seasons, breeding, non-breeding, the 2 migratory seasons, etc., those are available on the state agency website that I just highlighted, but we're giving you the percent breeding population information here for the focal species in the focal species table. And so I'm showing you an example here for Pennsylvania. So let's take a bit of a closer look on this table, and I'll kind of explain what this information means. So looking at wood thrush, for example, what this tells us is that during the breeding season, about 10% of the global wood thrush population exists within the geographic boundaries of Pennsylvania. And we see this as a strong connection to stewardship responsibility. That means that if you are someone who is in charge of like making decisions for Pennsylvania, 10% of the global population of this bird is within your geographic realm during the breeding season. And that can be really important to know. We can take another look here. Brad had talked about cerulean warbler, for example. And this tells us that about 8.8% of the cerulean warbler global breeding population occurs in Pennsylvania as well. So again, if you're interested in seeing percent of population information for all species and seasons in a state, you can access that information for free from the state agency summary website that's linked from the Southern Wings Guide. Next, I wanted to turn our attention to this resource called Shared Stewardship Connections Maps. Shared stewardship maps show where species that breed in a state are concentrated during the non-breeding season. And on the Southern Wings online guide, you'll see 2 versions of this map that Brad had very nicely set up. So the shared stewardship map that I'm showing on the left here shows where species that breed in a state are concentrated during the non-breeding season. But because many species winter in the same regions, these maps may start to look similar between neighboring states. And since we also wish to emphasize uniqueness of these connected geographies as well, we can modify the methods to produce a shared stewardship uniqueness map, which is the one that I'm showing on the right-hand side. And these maps emphasize a given state's ability to uniquely contribute to certain areas. And I think that these maps are best used in tandem. We want to look at both of them when we're thinking about applications. The first one gives us a broader understanding of the strength of connections. And then the second one lets us know where my state has a unique responsibility. Now, these maps include data for a subset of the species that occur in a state. And so I wanted to show you how we choose the species to put in these maps. So because we're interested in just showing where species are concentrated during the non-breeding seasons, we need to select species that actually migrate out of the state. And so we start with a full list of all the species that occur in that state. And then we filter it out so that at least 1% of the species' total breeding population has to occur in the given state. So there's got to be like a significant stewardship responsibility to start. And at least 85% of the breeding population migrates out during the non-breeding season. And so note that this can also mean that some geographically smaller states will have fewer birds that fit this criteria. For example, the map for Delaware just has a few species. If there's particular interest with looking at certain species for a state, for that, I would point you to the eBird Status and Trends website to look at single species maps and how they, where those birds are at different times of the year. I also wanted to point out that there's additional resources on the state level eBird website that explain how these maps are created. There's a video tutorial there. This is also a place where you can download the GIS raster data behind these maps too, if you wanted to plot it or crop it or play with it yourself. So let's take a closer look at one of these maps for Pennsylvania. So these shared stewardship maps are essentially the weighted sums of species non-breeding populations, where the percentage of a species breeding population in a given state is the weight. So it's like stacking up all the different non-breeding distribution maps at 3-kilometer resolution and weighting those sums by the state's stewardship responsibility for each species during the breeding season. So if a species has a higher percent breeding population in a state, its non-breeding map will contribute more to that state's shared stewardship. It's important to note also that the non-breeding connections shown in these maps are at the species level, not the population or the individual level. So the individual level information, we need tracking data for that, of course. And so for that, I'd point you to the Audubon maps that we just heard about, which show a really great summary of where birds have been tracked in different locations. So this means that the individual birds that winter in the areas highlighted on this map here might not necessarily be the same individuals that breed in Pennsylvania, but they are members of the same species. So we're looking at species level connections. So when I look at this map, just like Bradley was sharing, I see some places that really get highlighted. Darker purple areas have stronger shared stewardship connections. And so looking at this map for Pennsylvania, I see these areas in Central America are really dark and very important. These blotches of dark color that I see in Central America correspond very nicely with the 5 great forests in Central America as well. Then I also see some areas of the Andes Mountains that are important for Pennsylvania. Next, let's take a look at the uniqueness map here. So this map starts to look a little bit different. You can actually see where, let's see if I can get this to pop, where these areas around Central America are not as dark anymore. And that's because these areas in Central America, especially the 5 great forests, are really important for a lot of different states. But when we're looking at the unique connections for Pennsylvania, there's some areas in the Northern Appalachians that pop out to me, and then some other pockets in South America that seem to be really important as well. So with this information in hand, we can start to identify the regions within the non-breeding grounds which hold high importance for the species that breed in a state. And I think when combined, when this information is combined with information from the focal species table, the Audubon multi-species connections maps, and the other resources on the Southern Wings online guide, we hope that this information will help connect the conservation efforts of U.S. states with the really impactful work of partners operating outside of the U.S. So thank you, and with that, I'll hand it back to Deb.
Thanks, everybody. Oh my gosh, there's every time I hear some of this, I feel like I learn more and think about new ways to use it and, oh, what, you know, what we can continue to do with it into the future. So thank you all so much. Really appreciate your partnership and your help on creating the online guide and all of the partners and that are behind all the data that gets collected and put into these systems, and all the folks through eBird and everything else. I also wanted to acknowledge Callie Stanley. I think she's still on. She was a huge help for us as a leader through the University of Georgetown on pulling this all together, and particularly the last 5 or 6 months, like couldn't have done it without her. So thank you so much. I do want to open it up to questions. I haven't seen anything go into the chat yet. But, you know, we've got these folks here to answer your questions. Got about 13, 14 minutes if you have any about the guide, about the maps, any of the state level data. So I'm going to open it up and see if there are any questions. Oh, thank you, Callie. I guess her camera is on the fritz, so we can't see her, but thank you. Andy, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, in one of the tables, you had the focal marked yes or no, and it mentions that that's when there's a focal species account available. What is the species focal account? What is that referring to?
It is an area, if you go to the Southern Wings website, let me see if I can pull it up right now. And hold on 1 second. See if I can share my screen here. All right, hopefully you can see that. And so they were talking about the table that is right here and whether it has a focal species account. That is whether there is information within, and Jill and Erica can correct me, the Migratory Bird Explorer, to provide a little bit more information down here below. So you scroll down and you'll see this list of species that could be expanded. And then for those individual species, you'll see connection maps if they are available through the Migratory Bird Explorer, and some information on conservation challenges and threats. Does that answer your question, Andy?
Yeah, absolutely. That's really cool. Thanks.
Yep. I see Alan has another question. Is it possible to download the animated map showing migration by time period? So it is possible. I think those were in Andrew's presentation. And Andrew, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but if you go and sign into your eBird account, you can then go to science and the status and trends. And then let's just say we see a wood thrush there. So let's put in wood thrush. And then you get to the data. And in the upper right corner here, you'll see downloads. And so I'll just, you see right here, weekly abundance animation. And if you click on that, it will download that over here. And then you would be able to put it into a PowerPoint presentation or anything like that. Andrew, am I correct there?
Absolutely correct. That's exactly what I did for the slide that you saw there. One thing that I'll add is that you see on Deb's screen right now, it says access key required. That's a free access key that will take 3 seconds to generate. It's just because this is funded by the National Science Foundation, and so we just need to know how many people are using it.
Great, thanks. Yeah, these maps come in really, really handy. Are you raising your hand, Glenn? Couldn't tell.
I wasn't, but I do have I think it was Andrew or maybe it was Erica's comment. Is it possible to, it said we're not trying to estimate the percentage of impact of the conservation challenges. Is there any efforts to kind of lump up or ballpark estimates of conservation challenges? I spend a lot of time with my grandkids on Southern California beaches, and the dog impact, I see a coastal disturbance. And I'd just like to know, I mean, in Morro Bay, we've got 49 chapters of Audubon, a lot of them along the coast in California. Should we be focused on that? And can this help us?
So I'll start, and Erica, please add in. So Glenn, it's an excellent question. The Explorer does not show impact. It shows where there's co-occurrence or an overlap. So with the dogs, for example, and you can see, I think it's coastal modification. There are two different conservation challenges. If you have a bird species in mind and you see large red dots around those coastal areas where you're spending time, what that means is there's a lot of coastal impact. There's a large area of the coast is impacted by, I should say, a large portion of that area along the coast has coastal modification. And there are also a large number of those species. That doesn't necessarily mean there's a large amount of birds dying there, but what it says is there's a high potential for there to be a conflict. And so my recommendation actually for chapters is if they see those areas along the coast to have a shorebird species and coastal modification, really dark dots, that's where they might want to focus their efforts. Because that means any kind of education or engagement projects for keeping dogs off of beaches, that will likely have a big benefit for birds. So that's the one way they can use it for conservation. Big areas where we say, those represent opportunities. So if we're making, implementing practices that are keeping the beaches dog free while birds are nesting on the beach, we can have a big impact on protecting them.
Thank you.
I think one thing that I wanted to add to that quickly is another way to kind of look at the potential impacts and places to focus is looking at the population trends of the birds as well. And that's something that we didn't talk about today with the online guide, but maybe if it's okay with you, I'll just quickly share screen. Just to show, Deb was just on this website as well. This is on the eBird Status and Trends website. And this is another data product that's available, which shows, in this case, for cerulean warbler, the population trend between 2012 and 2022. It's at 27-kilometer resolution. And so this is another tool that we find can be useful to kind of narrow in on where birds are declining, combined with the information from Audubon, which kind of highlights places of overlap with different potential threats and impacts.
Thanks, Andrew. That is a really interesting map. I need to check those out. I see a question, and I think I'll just share my screen to answer it. A question about the list of species within the shared stewardship map. So if you were on the site, and you were here, you would see this "How were the maps created?" link. If you click on that, you then see an option to download the complete list of birds that were included in this map. So that would provide you with that information. Good question. You're welcome. Any other questions or comments? Okay, Matt Williams, how granular are the maps? Can they point us to individual hotspots for migration and need for conservation action because of their importance? Any Erica, Jill, or Andrew want to take that?
Happy to jump in. Those shared stewardship maps that we're using the eBird relative abundance estimates, those are generated at 3 by 3 kilometer resolution across the entire combined non-breeding ranges of all of the birds. So 3 by 3 kilometer resolution is what we're using there. And from our experiences, that's been a really useful resolution for getting toward very specific areas and projects.
Maybe I'll add a little bit that, for example, highlighting the Yucatan, when we look at some of the shared stewardship maps, or even if you look at the full annual distribution animations, it has been very useful to identify some of these hotspots and some of these areas of concentration, not just for wintering, but also for migration. So what we show is the concentrations throughout kind of that entire period. And so you will be able to see, for example, some coastal areas light up, or the mountain ranges up in the Andes and South America. So it has been really, really useful to showcase these hotspots where conservation action needs to happen. And I just want to highlight that there is a lot of habitat information that goes into these models. So we have, for example, nighttime lights, or we have road density, et cetera. And one of the things that Andrew is actually working on, that ideally a few papers will come out in the next couple of years, is looking at how to visualize some of the habitat drivers for these large concentrations of birds, or at these hotspots, to help guide conservation actions a bit more directly.
Thanks, Viviana.
I'll just add one thing to that. On the Explorer, it's very much at a coarser scale, which is, for the Explorer, in terms of resolution, we are getting down to around 50 kilometers, and that's because of the resolution of the tracking data. And it's intended to be sort of a complement for what Cornell has been doing with the eBird data. I do want to call attention, though, to some additional products that are coming out of Audubon and with partners, because those same data that are on the Explorer, while they are coarser resolution, we are working with our conservation staff throughout the hemisphere and partners to take those tracking data and to map migratory pathways and look for some concentrations to some of those hotspots during migration where pathways can converge. And so there are different resources out there outside of the Explorer in reports and peer-reviewed publications. And I did also want to, I saw that there was one more question that I did want to, somebody asked about whether there was an option to select multiple states like the Midwest or a joint venture. Currently, we don't have plans to create those summaries and put them on the online guide. But given that we have these data, creating new summaries for different areas like a joint venture is certainly possible. So please reach out to Audubon, and we can help with that, at least for tracking and connectivity data.
Thanks. Yeah, we'll share everybody's contact information. I know we're at the top of the hour here. Catherine, I just wanted to touch on your point. I think we, having just put the guide out there, I don't know if we have an exact state that has done that, but we use this information to share with the state of Ohio, which is the most recent state to join full annual cycle work with Southern Wings. And those maps really guided them to wanting to work on cerulean warbler conservation and in the Colombian Andes. And I think if Brad would have finished his presentation, you would have seen it all the way from, okay, how do I start narrowing into locations, and then get down to that specific. So then what a state could do then is say, oh, here's a project in Colombia. I'm going to incorporate some of this information into my state wildlife action plan, or talk about the importance generally of full annual cycle work for cerulean warblers and how that links to the state. We also, on the Southern Wings site where the online guide is, we have resources that are template language for state wildlife action plans, template language for overall annual cycle conservation work. And Catherine, you can reach out to myself or Brad Wilkinson if you want to talk some more about those possibilities, but I did just want to address that quickly in the end here. I'll put my, you're welcome. I'll put my email in the chat, and we are also, I guess the last thing I'm going to say is there will be about 5-minute long videos that also go over all of this on the website. Audubon, AFWA, and Cornell Lab have all created one that'll be useful snippets that folks can go to think a little more about, oh, how would I use this for my state and to make conservation investment decisions and put information in my SWAP. So those will be available. This will be recorded. I'll share all of those links, this and the contacts for our partners. And, you know, I was on 2 calls in the past couple of weeks on conservation investment strategies, and one of the ones for Caribbean Slope and Eastern Forest that Partners in Flight is working on. And I think, you know, there's just so much data and information now on where we can work to have the most impact to really bring back these species. And this is just another tool. And so I'm hopeful as a community that we can all kind of work together and figure out how to use this data and information to make some really great conservation investment decisions for all these species. So thanks, everyone. Thanks to all our presenters, and hope you all have a good rest of the day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everybody.